Welcome to this talk this afternoon by Professor Young. This year is given and sponsored by the 21st Century China program here in San Diego in the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We are a professional student of national affairs and public policy. We offer master's degree programs to teach after Chinese economic affairs. So this is our little advertisement for this school that takes place. Professor Young is Grace Lee Bar, Professor of Education and Sociology at the Annenberg School of Communication and Equipment Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he developed several people, culture, and society, and served as deputy director of the Center for the Study of Technology. He has a PhD from Beijing, University of Foreign Languages in Beijing. Got another degree, another PhD at NYU, and he's authored like 7 books, and his work covers a range of sociology topics that we're extremely interested in. Have to do with collective memory, evolution, have to do with civil society, movements, and especially these days have to do with the internet and the use of the internet and social media in China today and its influence on Chinese society. So today he's going to talk about his latest book, which is about the Wuhan Lockdown, and he's going to tell us about consequences of lockdown and how the victims influence history subsequent to that. And the book is about the lockdown and the voices of Wuhan people. So with that, welcome, President.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Madsen, for your very kind introduction. And I want to thank the 21st Century China Center for inviting me to campus, and I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about my recent book. As you see here, Wuhan Lockdown. On the right, on the left-hand side is the cover of the original copy from Columbia University Press, but I'm also really happy that Dr. Collins brought out a reprint edition for India, Southeast Asian market, which is on the right hand. The content is exactly the same, page numbers are exactly the same, just the cover are different. So let's just start by showing a little bit about how residents in Wuhan documented their experiences through their own stories. As we remember that Wuhan was officially locked down on January 23rd, 2020. As soon as this happened, we began to see personal diaries, and they were literally called lockdown diaries, being posted and shared on social media. And within a few days, the numbers of these diaries really increased rapidly. They also attracted a lot of attention because they provided very intricate personal details about the kind of experiences people are going through. And we remember that Wuhan was the first city in the global pandemic to be officially locked down. Lockdown meaning traffic in and out of the city was completely suspended. Air traffic, train, subway, river transportation completely suspended. And it was really something that extraordinary, for many people. It's upsetting. Really upset their daily lives overnight. You woke up on the morning of the 24th and you couldn't go out. In these personal diaries, people recorded all kinds of experience. Here is the three snapshots. So the first one was dated January 23rd, first day of the lockdown. On the right-hand side was dated February 25th. It was a diary posted by a volunteer at the community, who basically documented her experiences as a volunteer. And here on the bottom, February 16th, is one person who started posting her experiences after she and her family, her parents and grandparents, all tested positive. And she said, I wanted to document my life for this period. And from then on, she began to post daily a lot of information about her personal life. So we see here photographs and texts, a lot of photographs. But people also on the right-hand side posted video diaries, right? Online blog, on streaming blogs. And these attracted audiences as well. In the middle here were, responses that social media users provided to the diaries that they read. And these were very, very encouraging responses to the diary writer. I think this one was just I randomly selected one page of comments. All these comments ran on for hundreds of pages on social media. And these were responses to the daily postings of a doctor from the Wuhan Central Hospital. And he wrote about the death of 5 of his colleagues in the early days of the pandemic in very detailed format, but also very moving style, very easy to read. So attracted a lot of readers. He became a kind of celebrity. And because he was the director of the pain department in the hospital, his writing was called pain style. Now, on the very left side, again, random page from another diarist who happened to be also a poet, published poet, and he recorded, documented in detail, also every day, throughout the 76 days of the Wuhan lockdown. Wuhan lockdown lasted for 76 days, and a lot of people wrote throughout this period. So this is only a few random samples from my archives. I was following these, reading these every day and saving them onto my own computer, building my own archive. But there are numerous others, couldn't show here. But the point is that Wuhan residents, hundreds of them, documented in great detail the experiences that they had. And this was extraordinary. Recall what was happening in 2003 during the SARS crisis. At that time, the internet was already, quite developed, but not as developed, certainly as now. And people were talking about what was happening in Guangdong or in Beijing. Beijing, one hospital was completely locked down, but there were relatively very little kind of personal documentation of that history, which turned out to be a very important history too. So when I read these documents as a sociologist, I immediately realized these are really extraordinarily valuable personal documents, really sociological materials for understanding the daily experiences of the people during this period. And I began to think about how I can write about their experiences.
Be able to now?
Thank you. So how can academics write about Wuhan? That's the question I thought a lot, of course, when I wanted to write about it, that I knew from the very beginning when I started reading these documents. But how to write about these experiences, how to write about Wuhan was not an easy job. Was actually full of challenge because very soon, we remember in mid-March, we ourselves, I was in Philadelphia, of course, after the spring break, we didn't go back to school, didn't go back to campus. We had our own lockdown. And US-China trade war, right, was still escalating. There was already an anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism, hate crimes. There was a lot of vilifying of China, as here this op-ed and notes that vilifying China puts a bullseye on the backs of Asian Americans. I see around me, and I hear stories from people I know around the country about this kind of experiences they were going through on this side. And then mainstream media here were covering Wuhan, but I felt that the kind of experiences I was reading about from the personal documents shared on social media, circulated really widely on social media, was not covered very adequately at all. In general, I also felt that in academic discourse, some concepts, again, struggling with how to write about Wuhan as academic, I realized that some concepts in our field have come to dominate our thinking to the extent that it's no longer easy to try to think outside the box. Now, there's the kind of language, vocabulary that we take for granted and we can use easily because it's there. That's what is available. That's the kind of language we speak. But then the language, of course, is important, but not always helpful. And this is a very interesting article from this book, Evolutionary Governance in China. One of the editors is Professor Kelly Tsai, who also wrote the introduction to this book, and where she provides this table, which shows dozens and dozens of concepts, which are all about how scholars of China describe Chinese authoritarianism. So we have resilient authoritarianism, consolidative Leninism, revolutionary authoritarian. I won't need to read down, but the whole list of language, of concepts, all related, all authoritarianism. So she has a very interesting way of describing this. So she said it's authoritarianism in China with adjectives, all kinds of adjectives, dozens of these from 1987 to 2019, with citation numbers on the right. A lot of them are very highly cited. They certainly shape our thinking about China. And this is the kind of language that we have. And the question I was thinking when I was starting to think about writing about Wuhan at a very early age of the pandemic, not knowing what was going to happen, how this was going to unfold. So, in a sense, it's just not a good idea to start thinking and writing about an unfolding event like that. How can you draw any conclusion, any meaningful conclusion, which may be proved to be wrong, right, by the turns of events? I thought about how to, take a possibly different experiment with a different kind of approach. How to see China and try to see the unseen part of China without being constrained by the vocabulary, by the language that we are familiar with. A kind of loosening up of our conceptual apparatus. So in a sense, Wuhan lockdown turns out, to me personally, it turns out to be an experiment in the loosening up of our conceptual language. What I try to do is to document what I think was the most important legacy of the Wuhan lockdown, which is the experiences of the ordinary people in residence through storytelling instead of through theorizing, right? Typical social science analysis, abstraction, conceptualization. And I try to do so by reenacting the scenes and characters of the lockdown drama. It was dramatic 76 days, because every day important incidents, events, public events happened. So in that sense, it was a very dramatic period of life. And I thought, at this point, it's difficult to theorize about it. It's difficult to theorize about the experiences of people who are still suffering in the middle of an unfolding pandemic. What I can do is to try as much as I can to tell some of their stories. And that's the strategy I come up with. So the focus, the approach is really, I try to focus on scenes and characters. And in a sense, I thought of this as kind of both a methodological and a theoretical approach in the following senses. Scenes, as we think of everyday life, as consisting of a sequence, a series of scenes, right? Scenes happen and disappear and happen again. They are fleeting situational happenings. But of course, things always happen in social and institutional contexts. They are shaped by social institutional factors, but they are not determined by contexts, in the sense that we can think about incidents where the same people may behave differently when the situations change, right? It's not deterministic approach. It's non-deterministic and non-reductive in that sense. So that's the kind of approach I try to take, and I try to explain this a little bit in the conclusion part of the book. For the most part, the book focuses on storytelling. The first two chapters provides the context, some historical context, contemporary context, and beginning from chapter 3, every chapter takes up one major theme, which emerges through my reading of these lockdown diaries. These are, I read so many of them and read them, again and again. And pretty soon, important themes began to emerge. And these themes became the titles of my chapters. Again, my plan was, the writing was itself evolving. Initially, when I submitted the book proposal, I planned to write 6 chapters. The book proposal has 6 chapters. But later on, we know that the pandemic developed in many different directions. Rise of nationalism, for instance. So I added new chapters, added a chapter on nationalism, added a chapter on mourning and collective memory. So eventually, I have 9 chapters. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the time here I have is to try to just to give an example of one scene from one chapter, and just to give a sense. I may not have time actually to go through all this, the rest of these chapters from chapter 3, but I will just go as much as I can, and hopefully I'll stop. We can leave some time for questions and comments. So this scene is from chapter 3, People's War. Just before this, so this is one of the incidents that happened in Wuhan. The number 1 leader on the ground in Wuhan was Vice Premier Sun Tunlan, sent to lead the efforts on the war against COVID. So one day in February, she led a group of municipal and provincial leaders on a tour of a local community inspection tour. And as these leaders entered the compound, they heard shouts of fake and fake from these high rises, from behind apartment, from the windows of the apartments. Residents were protesting, shouting fake and fake. What were they shouting about? the morning of their visit, the residential community began to deliver free groceries to the residents. So there were promises of free groceries because of the lockdown, shopping was very difficult, right? This kind of complaints, after that, we began to hear again and again. Shanghai, right? It was particularly terrible. So the morning of that visit inspection, suddenly the residential community began to deliver free groceries. It was, of course, to show to the leaders that, well, we are very, we are doing our best to help our residents. But the residents were protesting, were shouting to the central leaders that this was just a show. That, it was not, this hadn't been done. It's supposed to have been done much earlier. There were promises early on, but they were not doing. So there was fake and fake. This was a kind of protest. So I've described that scene before this passage. So here in this passage, I try to show how diarists responded to this incident. So in this fake case, such cries produced instant results. After an inspection, Vice Premier Sun called a meeting with provincial and municipal leaders to address citizen complaints. Mr. Amber, one of the diarists in my collection, was moved by Vice Premier Sun. And she wrote, she's at such an advanced age, but has stood by us Wuhan people all the time. She never abandons us or gives us up on us. I'm moved that I salute her excellency. At the age of 70, Sun Chunlan is the oldest of the 10-member executive meeting of the State Council and the only female member. Mr. Amber saluted her not only as a high-ranking government leader, but also as a senior citizen looking after the affairs of her fellow citizens, the figure of a caring mother and aunt. For Mr. Amber, Vice Premier Sun's dedication at her age gave her an aura of moral authority. Ye Qing, another diarist in my collection, found the citizens' outcries to the Vice Premier quite effective. And Mr. Ye wrote, these shouts will probably lead to the penalty of a few officials, but they were beneficial to the residents. So this is just one incident. And I didn't go into detail to analyze the relationship between the citizens and the authorities as reflected here. But as we can see, it's a kind of moral relationship. It's not the kind of usual resistance, right? Citizen resistance, oppression kind of relationship. But it's much more subtle, more nuanced kind of relationship. And in this case, the Vice Premier Sun was saluted, not just as a government leader, but as a senior citizen, caring mother, almost like a mother figure, caring for the people. So this is just one of many, many scenes that I try to present in this chapter. This chapter really focuses on government policies, lockdown policies, and citizens' direct responses to these government policies, including a lot of complaints and protests. They are not protesting the policies themselves. They supported the policies. They protested when they felt that the policies were not implemented well. In this case, for instance, they were locked down, but they didn't get the grocery shopping, that the groceries they were promised. And therefore, they were really resentful about that. There were several other related similar cases of complaints. So that's one example, chapter 3. Chapter 4 is called Online Diaries. In this chapter, I try to document what the diarists themselves were writing about their own personal emotional experiences, especially how they personally navigate the lockdown. And diary writing was such a way of navigating the lockdown. Again, there are all kinds of really fascinating stories, and they wrote their diaries in different formats, as I mentioned right early on, in text, photography, live streaming, and in this case, this is a painting. So this is a story, and I used the original photograph on the cover of my book, and the story itself was very moving. So on this day, this doctor was taking an 87-year-old COVID patient across the campus of the hospital to the other side for a CT test. And in the middle of their trip over, they paused to watch the sunset about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The volunteer, who was a college student who was with them, took this photograph and then posted this photograph online. Immediately went viral because now those were the most distressful, fearful days of the lockdown relatively early on. And this photo brought a sense of hope, conveyed a sense of hope, because there was a lot of fear, of anxiety. And suddenly, you care enough to pause, watch the sunset. And this person, Xiao Meili, she drew a series of sketches about major incidents during the Wuhan lockdown. This was one of them. And she would also write about her thoughts, share her thoughts about these incidents. And this is what she wrote about. And this is from the book. From the photo gives off an aura of warmth, tranquility, and hope. Posted on social media, it was an instant hit. And I quoted a number of diaries and their responses. The first one is Lanxi wrote that the photo gave him a magical feeling. Quote, the dead are resting in peace, the living are strong. Each and every one of these difficult days must be cherished. Each and every one of those photo shots must be remembered. Feminist activist Xiao Meili painted a watercolor of the photo and accompanied it with the following reflections. And this is her reflection. Under conditions of pressure and anxiety, many people had a sense of serious deprivation. And the two of them cared enough to stop and watch the sunset. This is like you still maintain your habit of growing flowers, even though you were living in plight. This act represents life beyond bare existence. It transcends the if others can manage, why can't you kind of admonition. I suppose this is why the image moves me. So I was very interested in how people respond to this kind of public events. And a lot of the diaries also documented their personal responses, like this one. So we see, a little incident like this had the effect of building a sense of hope and solidarity for many people. I only quoted two of the many diarists. And of course, people will be posting, sharing, retweeting these photos on social media, on WeChat, on Weibo, frequently. So chapter 4 consists of a series of stories pulled from their personal diaries about their experiences during that period. Chapter 5, Fire and Thunder. This is borrowed from the Fire Mountain, Thunder Mountain Special Hospital built for the COVID temporary hospital built for the COVID patients. So it's about patients and doctors and health workers. This is the main theme of this chapter. And I have stories about several patients and several doctors. And we get a sense get a sense of how individuals responded when they found out they tested positive. Nowadays, it's a different story. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was a very different kind. It's just so much fear. It's being tested positive. It's like a death sentence. That's the kind of experience that people were having emotionally. So here, this very short, actually, Anian, one of the diarists, wrote very detailed accounts of her experiences. But this is one passage from from the book, where I recount her story, and this is her description of the moment when she and her father, when she was tested positive. She and her father took COVID tests that morning. 2 days later, they checked the results online via their phones. The father's result was negative. She made a screenshot of her own result and shared it in her family's WeChat group. See, I'm negative too, she wrote. After looking at her screenshot closely, though, her father said, how come you are positive? She saw her result was indeed positive. The father looked at his phone and then at her. His eyes, this is her, in her own words, his eyes were full of such fear and pain as I'd never seen before. Then he began to murmur to himself, how can you be positive? How can you be positive? And then she described really that her father was almost collapsing after learning that she was tested positive. So patients' stories like this, also patient stories of square dancing in the temporary shelter hospitals and how that was sort of organized and how they got a sense of strength and solidarity and camaraderie in the middle of a very depressing time. And the stories about doctors, I started this chapter with the doctor of the pain style, doctor, very moving stories about their own sacrifices. Also talk about some of the problems with the hospital authorities, especially with central hospital. Okay, chapter 6. Is that a little too brief? Just one story from one chapter, and just give a sense. Feel free to stop me if there are questions. So chapter 3 focuses on civic organizing, and I sort of provide the context in chapter 2 about the retreat of civil society in the past decade, declining the involvement of NGOs, crackdown on NGOs, and so on and so forth. Despite that kind of context, we still see a flourishing of civic organizing. But especially civic organizing through digital media, social media. And here is just one example that I thought is an interesting example of feminist organizing. This is about a group of feminist activists, after the lockdown started, found out there was an increasing incidence of domestic violence. So they started a campaign to try to call the public, call attention to this issue of domestic violence. What they did was they posted open letters on social media, on Weibo, and encouraged individuals who read these letters to print them out and post them on the walls of their neighborhood. Right? So this is about the experiences of a couple of these young people who faced the moment when they were doing this and how that actually was not an easy thing to do. So posting the letter in public spaces was not as easy as it may sound. It was a daring act, in a sense. In her diary post on March the 6th, Guobin wrote that many individuals felt nervous about it, as if they were thieves, because public spaces were usually occupied by commercial ads or political slogans. Citizens rarely feel entitled to post their own information. Therefore, putting up the open letter on anti-domestic violence was both a means of supporting victims and assertion of citizens' right to use public space for sharing information. Several days later, Guobin shared the story of a campaign participant in Guangzhou. This volunteer was excited about joining the campaign after she learned about it from friends. But when it was time to do the actual work, she dithered and procrastinated. She thought to herself that maybe she should go out at night to post the letter, but then changed her mind because at night she could not take a nice photo. So the point of this is print out, post it in your neighborhood, and take photo, post it again back to the social media. So it's a kind of circular way of disseminating the information. Eventually, she still did it, but it took a lot of courage. So this is just one story of the kind of civic organizing, very creative, that was happening in that period. A lot of other efforts to mobilize, to raise funds, donations, domestic rescue of pets, animals during that time. All right, so that's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is about censorship. So it's called Game of Words. And so it's a chapter about a number of stories that happened at the time. And one of this was about the story of Dr. Effen from Central Hospital, Wuhan Central Hospital, Dr. Li Wenliang's colleague. And at some point, she took an interview with Renwu people, and basically angrily shared her story about how she was censored for sharing information about in the early days of the pandemic. And when Renwu published her story, it was censored. But then online, internet users started a relay. They literally called it a relay, like in race and track, right? Track and field race, right? A relay in order to keep the story alive on the web. So it's a really pretty detailed description of the account. What's the most interesting, creative part of this relay is that being savvy users, people just remixed the original text of the story, which is translated as the whistle giver. The person who gave the whistle to Dr. Li Wenliang, who was called the whistleblower, turned this text into numerous languages, foreign languages, Chinese dialects, Mao calligraphy, all kinds of creative formats, so that the software used to filter, censor postings will not be able to block them. And this one, I have it in the book. I included 2 images. This is a monument version of the article, and the article, basically the text. The text is carved on this monument, and this is just one of numerous versions of that text that was being relayed as a way to challenge censorship of this story. As a result, the story really became very widely known, and also I think exposed many ordinary people to the practice of censorship. Not every, censorship on a daily basis. Not everybody experiences that kind of censorship. You're in WeChat, WeChat family WeChat. You talk about daily businesses. You don't experience it, but now people read stories about this, and they actually kind of new exposure to this kind of practice. So the whole story is about it's like a game of words, and there are also a number of other similar stories in this chapter 7. Chapter 8 was one of the chapters added later on, not originally my book although, and it's about nationalism. Nationalism, especially during COVID, was a very complicated topic to talk about. I think this is probably the longest chapter. I try to provide, instead of trying, one of my experimental approaches here, instead of trying to theorize or conceptualize, I try to tell stories, show the characters, and provide the context, and try not to make judgments, try not to explain, although I think I still explain more than I intended after reading another kind of habit of writing. So here is a kind of response to one of the wolf warriors, right? There's the wolf warriors of the Chinese foreign ministry, and we here often wonder why would these wolf warriors behave this way, and tend not to keep in mind that they have an audience back home. And very often they were playing to the home audience. And here we see Zhao Lijian, I think, making his first appearance as a foreign ministry spokesperson, and immediately took a very tough tough kind of position when he responded to journalist questions. And eventually he was given a nickname called Rejoinder Zhao. And a number of diaries he wrote about how they disliked his style. This is the style that they've been waiting for. They wanted some kind of spokesperson who could be tough because of all these Western media stories, conspiracy theories about origins of the Kung Fu virus, and so on and so forth. So some stories about these. This chapter really has a lot of stories about national, also about everyday, like auntie figure, how an auntie figure suddenly was reading Fang Fang's diary, and at some point suddenly completely changed her position and began to call Fang Fang a traitor, became a very strong nationalist. And I try to sort of, as I said, try to provide some context and background. And here, I sort of basically cite some literature from studies of global populism, and as well as studies of American talk show media, where really outrage is a technique to grow your audience. You speak outrageously, and then you can win more audience. And this is, in one book, a political scientist said this kind of global populist style has three essential elements. And I think all these three essential elements apply very well to the kind of style of the wolf warriors, the Chinese foreign ministry. Appeal to the people instead of the elite, adoption of low language, bad manners, and use of dramatization of performance to induce a response to crisis and threat. In other words, it's almost like a global style of global populism. That's chapter 8. And chapter 9 is the last main chapter before the conclusion, is about mourning and remembering. You mainly focusing on Li Wenliang. On the right-hand side, you see this. This is a memorial for Li Wenliang set up on blockchain. Because people then were worried that eventually memories of Li Wenliang would disappear from the website. How to preserve his memories, his stories permanently. And somebody put up this memorial on blockchain, which is supposedly to stay there permanently. But there are many other things happening at the time in terms of how people were mourning and remembering Li Wenliang and remembering the experiences, traumatic experiences of the time. One thing they did was they read carefully all Li Wenliang's Weibo postings. And on the basis of their reading, they basically turned his story into almost like a fictional stories, some shorter, some longer versions. And then posted these stories as almost like character portrait, circulating online, a lot of versions of them. And here is this one version. Kind of online style has some humor in it. Li Wenliang was born in the 80s. He loved fried chicken, hot pot, and Japanese sushi. He liked posting food photos on Weibo, but some of them were quite ugly. He used to play badminton, but gained weight in recent years. Even my dad's figure is better than mine. So things like that. Basic idea is that people saw Li Wenliang, who was celebrated as a hero, as a truly ordinary person. It's just like us. Every one of us could be a Li Wenliang. Li Wenliang could be every one of us, which could also mean that his tragedy could also happen to us. So that's a kind of way of mourning and remembering Dr. Li Wenliang. So there are also more open protest activities. And diaries wrote about, every diarist would write about Li Wenliang the day of his death. 1 year after his death, the first anniversary of Li Wenliang's death, one of the diaries that I cited here documented a little incident that happened to him. He was in a taxi going across town. And in the middle of it, they're crossing the tunnel, and in the middle of it, the taxi driver suddenly said, "Today is the first anniversary of Dr. Li Wenliang's death." Just a regular taxi driver driving a customer across the tunnel out of nowhere said, "Today is the first anniversary of Dr. Li Wenliang." And the diarist recorded this document. I think this just shows that even though postings may disappear from cyberspace, people do remember, and they remember in their own ways. So this is the chapter that I end with, and then the conclusion. Conclusion, like I said, I didn't venture to theorize, but of course, you can't really write a book without some kind of framework, right? Implicit kind of guidance and some kind of theory. So in the conclusion, I try to pull this together a little bit, but not trying to, again, it's a way of organizing some ideas. So basically, my arguments here, and I try not to present it as a kind of arguments, again, storytelling, is that these four themes, politics of appearance, active citizenship, moral feelings, and digital infrastructures, the combination, mingling of these four main factors underlie all the major stories that I told in the book. In other words, the drama of the Wuhan lockdown was made possible, if you want to theorize a little bit, by a combination of these four major characters, these four major factors. And I don't think I'll have time to, the politics of appearance, in the sense, there's a lot of talk about formalism, critique of formalism, 形式主义. 形式主义 had its very negative, harmful consequences, but it also was effective in the sense, in order to put up a good experience, the war on COVID had to be waged fearlessly, and effectively. So within 10 days or within 1 week, putting up a shelter hospital, live streaming the construction process, creating that kind of spectacle, showing the effectiveness of the policy, that's also kind of appearance of formalism. Also, I try really to emphasize that citizens may not be activists in the sense that they are fighting for a cause, but they are active in the sense they are very engaged, and they are they're very vocal. They express their ideas and views and emotions in all kinds of ways. That's important. Moral feelings in the sense that people act within webs of social relations. The example of Vice Premier Sun Chunman is the illustration of that. Digital infrastructure really referring to the widespread use of WeChat, Weibo, cell phone, and is essential for a lot of things that happen. I will conclude with the last slide. It's like, being often asked, what about what has happened in recent year, since Shanghai lockdown, and I also wrote a couple of small pieces to try to join the discussions. And my basic point here is that if we see the logic of what was happening in Wuhan in 2020, we can understand much better what has happened since then. In the Shanghai lockdown, as well as most recently. So in one sense, the zero COVID policy was the logic of appearance taken to the extreme. but it doesn't have to be taken to the extreme. The result was not to become a lot of complicated factors can go into to analyze the situation. For instance, the abuse of the policy by local bureaucrats, by firms who wanted to make profits out of the testing and so on and so forth. But of course, also people have a new understanding of this virus after 2 years, and the virus is kind of a new variant, right? So a lot of situations have changed. The result wasn't really determined, but the logic, I think, is still there. And the logic of citizen activism, active citizens is also there to the extent that I would argue, because when these protests, last November, December protests happened, media outlets here celebrated this as these are unprecedented. And I immediately saw resemblances of this to what was happening in the time period. So in that sense, they were remarkable, but not unprecedented. There has always been a lot of active citizen activism during this period and throughout this recent decade. I'm sorry, I took more time than I intended. Thank you so much. I'll stop.
Thank you very, very much. Really important that we see the society from what up in this way. Give a whole perspective. Fortunately, most not available. So thank you very much. Now, we don't have a lot of time to have questions. I think we should do it this way. First of all, this is a hybrid session, so this is on Zoom and recorded. I hope that the people who want to ask questions on using Zoom can use the chat box and present their questions. Let those accumulate a little bit, but then we'll have at least one question here. Fortunately, probably can't have a lot. Then maybe you can summarize just of some of the questions on the Zoom. We can present those, and then we can do discussion and move on.
So Guobin is a great moving portrait of lives under lockdown. So it's given a lot of humanity to the people in Wuhan during this period. But my question is about you as a sociologist, your strategy in selecting that. Right? So there are Wuhan residents, there are migrants, there are people who are in somewhat higher positions. There are people who benefit a lot from this whole lockdown, there are people who suffer. And even though you say, I want to tell stories, but you still have to select, right? Cases. What went into your thinking when you decide on which stories to select to tell through this?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's a really important question. I didn't think of this book as providing the narrative, this story of the Wuhan. I felt that for any major historical event, we need to have numerous accounts of that event, of the grassroots scholars, sociologists, political scientists, historians, and my version would be just one version of many. So I would expect newer versions to appear, which would provide kind of different perspectives, maybe balancing my perspective. So the way I selected that, I tried to read as many as I could. All the diaries I found, I read them. I always enjoy reading different documents in my own sociological research on where God movement too. I read their diaries and letters. I like reading these documents. And as I said, as I read, sort of in terms of qualitative methodology, you read documents repeatedly, and you eventually certain major themes emerge. That's how I gradually over a period of months, I identified major themes that are touched on by a lot of these diarists. And these are the themes I decided I want to cover. So, and then it comes to what kind of quotations, stories I need to cite. So basically, I would cite stories about city organizing, right? From diaries which cover city organizing. Diaries about patients and doctors, I will put them in those chapters. So I basically begin to sort this. But it's true that lot of these diaries are probably, and they're city residents, they're urban residents. Migrant laborers, very few of them, at least we see few of the kind of personal documentation from them. They were struggling actually just to make a living during that period. But there are stories about them from some of the diarists. And I do have one story about a food delivery driver who was driving around the city at the beginning of the lockdown. And his experiences, his frustrations as well, that like he was delivering bags of food and then one of the bags was stolen. And he said, well, you know, this is like a spring festival and I'm delivering, you stole this from me and I'm a poor guy. Some stories like it and I try to battle them. But in general, of course, I don't, it's not a matter of representative. It's a matter of just to showcase the stories of the people who share a lot of similar experiences. I think, which basically are sometimes even major chapters in these chapters. Question here?
I have a question just from me, not from Zoom right now, but I was wondering how diarists interacted with censorship throughout their experience as diarists. Was there a growing awareness of censorship from them? Did you get a sense that they were in any way shaping their narratives, you know, with an awareness of what might be reasonable to see the light of day, stuff like that?
It was a daily struggle. People had to deal with censorship every day when they posted, and a lot of them actually documented the very frustrating experiences of how to post diary and how long it took to post an entry. One of them I cited, it took him an hour to post today's entry. It just wouldn't go through. Right? And he just tried to figure out which word was a sensitive word. Took him an hour to try multiple times. Eventually, he figured out that's one word, he changed it, and then it went through. So this kind of, stories also, there are a lot of them in the diaries. They documented their personal experiences, like managing sentence. We don't see this kind of stories a lot previously, but now we do. And Compound's diary are the same. There are a lot of stories we can share about how she really people who posted the diaries to manage.
I have a question. Just out of curiosity, did you come across any diaries mentioning about the origins of COVID virus? You know how outside of China, people were sort of pointing fingers at China for the origin of virus. How did Wuhan people feel about that kind of blaming from the outside, or were there any mention of it in any of the diaries or stories that you?
Well, there's some in the early period, people mentioned Huanan seafood market. There's some mention of that kind of. I guess that's part of the origin story, but mostly no. In the diaries, very little writing, very little documentation. People are not interested in discussing the origin story. As a matter of fact, later on, right, when the pandemic became spread around the world, and there was a lot of Western media discourse about conspiracy theories. The diarists, as well as the online public, really responded very sometimes vehemently against this kind of depictions. That's why the nationalistic sentiments became very strong. Early periods, nationalism was very benign because at the beginning of the lockdown, Japan sent donations, and on their packaging they used classical Chinese words to salute the Wuhan people. And a lot of people celebrated. Well, the Japanese, they were really great. And in contrast, the donations sent from inside China They only knew how to say 武汉加油. No classical words. That's also nationalism, but it's very benign kind of gradually became more radical as in response to the kind of media discourse outside of China.
You can summarize one.
So people online appear to be rapturously listening, but didn't have too many questions.
So maybe one more question. So
but hopefully this is a fun off topic, but in comparing the Wuhan lockdown to the Shanghai lockdown of last year, would you say there's any noticeable like differences in people's attitudes or just how sort of like this interesting almost culture around a lockdown has changed?
Yeah, there's one thing I noticed because, as I said, lockdown, as soon as it started, people began to post personal diaries about this. This didn't happen in Shanghai. In early March, Shanghai started. The Shanghai lockdown, of course, was not in fact the same as Wuhan initially, and there wasn't a lot of posting of personal accounts at all. And I was wondering what was happening. I think partly is probably because of, I think their kind of control of narrative and censorship of that kind of discourse in the wake of the lockdown. Because by late March and early April, we began to see the sudden growth of postings of these diaries. But these diaries have been written early on. They were written in early March, and then they were posted like, in one batch of 10 entries over a period of 10 days. So people have been writing, but they were not posting every day. That made a huge difference in terms of the social impact of these diaries. In the Wuhan period, because these were daily postings, after a while, it quickly became a kind of social ritual. People were waiting for Fang to post their diary. People were waiting for I followed a group of people. I was waiting to read these diaries every day. It became a kind of social rhythm. To the extent I think it was conducive to creating a sense of solidarity. Social rhythm that was really important at the time when society was disrupted by the pandemic. That didn't happen in China. China, late March, early April, posting of diaries. But let's say people began to post on March the 21st, and then they would also include diaries written the week before, 10 days before. They've been writing, but they didn't post. But then from then, I don't remember the exact date. From late March on, they began to post diaries every day for a short period of time, but not in the same kind of numbers as in. That's a major difference. I think it reflected, I think it's very revealing.
okay, we could go on for a long time, but we're debating others. So thank you very, very much for we could keep on discussing